Hello everyone, my name is Walter Silva and I'm a philosophy professor at Universidade Federal Rural do Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. My specific research area in philosophy is ethics and contemporary political philosophy, but I recently got a BA in biology, and my current research consists in applying the perspective of evolutionary theory to contemporary ethical and political discussions. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the International Big History Association and Daniel Barreiros, especially for the invitation to participate in the activities of the Big History Lab here in Rio de Janeiro. Well, my purpose in this very brief presentation is to approach warfare from the long-term perspective held by evolutionary psychology. First, I will comment on the theory of warfare developed by evolutionary psychologists Tooby and Cosmides and John Tooby, which suggests that warfare requires elaborate cooperation among members of one group to coordinate their aggressive actions against another group. Then I will present some points of the theory of the evolutionary anthropologist Richard Waingram, who defends the thesis that Homo sapiens is a species that domesticated itself through a process of execution of the most violent members of its groups. This has made us a species, according to Waingram, with low reactive aggression, if we compare ourselves to chimpanzees, but with high proactive violence, which is the cold and calculated violence. And this allowed us to develop the shocking levels of violence that we are capable of in wars, and more specifically in internal conflicts like gang band disputes. Well, this long-scale perspective will allow a better understanding of the causes of warfare, so that we can reflect on contemporary warfare and conflicts through the understanding that the human phenomenon of violence is highly sensitive to environment conditions. So my point here is that cultural, political, and economic institutions need to take this long-term evolutionary perspective into account in order to create conditions that promote more peaceful environments. Well, what Tooby and Cosmides defend is that warfare and coalitional aggression are human universals. They are phenomena that are not just restricted to cultural process that would be independent of biological phenomena. So, in this sense, coalitional aggression was evolutionarily selected because it promoted greater reproductive success by giving access to better and larger resources. Furthermore, Cosmides and Tooby will also prove that mortality rates do not negatively impact the fitness of male in the coalition. So we have this evolutionary paradox of war, which is, while it presents great costs and is very dangerous, of course, over millions of years in evolutionary times, war is a constant, always sought and glorified. The question is, why? Why does this happen? And for Cosmides and Tooby, we have to shift our focus from the view or from the perspective that war is simply violence and start thinking about its intense and complex system of social cooperation. So in this sense, war just occur in highly sophisticated animals like chimpanzees, dolphins, and humans, highly cognitively sophisticated animals. So we can conclude that in the cases of our species, Homo sapiens, the way in which we think about coalitions, intergroup competition, and war is the product of a long evolutionary process that occurred during the Pleistocene. But contrary to the hasty criticism of evolutionary psychology, there is no determinism in human behaviors. War is perhaps one of the best examples of the profound interaction between our evolved psychological dispositions and the environmental conditions in which we found ourselves. So I turn now to the theory of the evolutionary anthropologist Richard Wagram, presented in his book The Goodness Paradox: The Strange Relationship Between Virtue and Violence in Human Evolution. It was published in 2019 and somehow summarizes the studies carried out by Wagram over decades of his career. So, as I said before, Wangram's thesis is that Homo sapiens, like bonobos, but unlike chimpanzees, have gone through a process of self-domestication. So, this process made us less aggressive towards reactive violence, but much more aggressive towards proactive aggressions. So Wagram defines these two types of aggression: reactive, which is the hot, defensive, impulsive, and strong reaction aggression, and proactive aggression, which is cold, offensive, premeditated, and needs that we have high-level cognitive abilities. So what Wagram shows is that we went through a process that he calls the domestication syndrome, which began about 300,000 years ago. This self-domestication process involves the coalition of adult males who executed the socially undesirable, more violent individuals who sought to dominate the group. In this sense, we can consider the very improvement of morality as something that served this process of self-domestication. So, if we analyze then the most diverse societies of hunter-gatherers, we will see a low internal violence, but a highly external violence. This is the goodness paradox. How low levels of violence in our day-to-day lives versus high rates of death from violence in our wars. So, according to Wagram, we see several characteristics of this genetic adaptation that occurred in the domestication syndrome, such as smaller bodies, faces, teeth, jaws, and brains, less sexual dimorphism, the difference between male and female bodies, more docile behavior, and a huge reduction in reactive aggression. In this photo, we can compare a baby bonobo with a baby chimpanzee, and to see how some of these physical differences are present. Here we have the Hominidae family with its four genera: Pongo, Gorilla, Pan, in which are included chimps and bonobos, and our genus Homo. Here on the left we have a female and a male bonobos compared to a male and a female chimpanzee on the right. So characteristics such as small bodies and faces and less sexual dimorphism are evident. And finally, the comparison between Neanderthal and Homo sapiens. A central element, therefore, is that what led to the emergence of this difference between chimpanzees and bonobos, with the later bonobos having been self-domesticated, like Homo sapiens. And the answer to this difference lies in the fact that chimpanzees had to share their research with gorillas, and bonobos did not. So, as I said, self-domestication occurring in these years, and what Weigand does here is to take some ideas of the anthropologist Christopher Bowen, especially the concept of reverse dominance hierarchy, to elaborate what he calls his execution hypothesis, which is already, this is impressive, in Darwin in The Descent of Man. Darwin says, malefactors are executed or imprisoned for long periods, so that they cannot freely transmit their bad qualities. Violent and quarrelsome man often comes to a bloody end. So we have that this idea that capital punishment is a human universal, and capital punishment is carried out by men, but not by female coalitions against what we would call alpha male. Capital punishment is a leveling mechanism. Capital punishment is in the origins of learning, cooperation, communication, ability, morality, and even religion. And if we take the religions everywhere, they are controlled by men. So, what are the consequences of these evolutionary perspectives for the contemporary world, for the contemporary societies in which we live? First of all, we must see that we must recognize that the most extreme forms of violence that we have, such as war, slavery, torture, gang wars, they all are coalitionary proactive aggression. We have psychological adaptations evolved in the Pleistocene to promote coalitionary proactive aggression. So the question is, does this mean that both reactive and proactive violence are inevitable? And the answer is evidently not. With the emergence of modern states, we manage, as Steven Pinker shows in The Better Angels of Our Nature, to fantastically reduce the levels of violence in contemporary society. But that doesn't mean that violence has been extinguished, or even that it cannot increase its level again. This will depend precisely on what kind of environments are developed or stimulated in our societies. And as I said in the beginning, this long-scale perspective allows us to have a better understanding of the causes of warfare, so that we can reflect on contemporary wars and conflicts through the understanding that the human phenomenon of violence is sensitive to environmental conditions. So in order to adopt some preventive policies, it's necessary to be clear about this difference between reactive violence, which is very sensitive to the levels of social conditions, and proactive violence, whose prevention is much more complex and involves intelligence actions by the modern states to combat, for example, conflicts between gangs of drug dealers, which is one of the main causes of violence in countries like here, Brazil. And Brazil has one of the highest rates of violence in the world. Thank you very much.